Hi, I'm John, and welcome to Edgetone Studios. So, a couple months ago, I replaced my PreSonus Studio Live Series 3 mixer with the Cranborne Audio R8 interface, 500 series chassis, etc., with the 500 ADAT as an expansion. Now, I've made 3 videos on the R8. I made one basically just doing an overview of the system. I made one that was possible ways you could expand the system, and I made another one on how to integrate your effects while working with the R8. And in this fourth video, I thought I would cover the issues I ran into and some of the things you might not consider when setting up a 500 R8, and also the things I would love to see improved about the unit. So for those of you who haven't watched my channel before, I have a studio on Vancouver Island in the Cowichan Valley, this beautiful addition to my home that I built a number of years ago. But with my Parkinson's diagnosis and with some other changing life events, we've made the decision to move back to Victoria, which is an hour away, and our house is currently on the market. So if you know anyone who's looking for a beautiful 3,000 square foot home with a 700-ish square foot multi-room professional studio and wants to live on Vancouver Island, check out our real estate listing in the description below, assuming you're watching this while it's still on the market, because currently it's on the market. Let's get to the Cranborne R8. This unit, I've just really enjoyed the hands-on control. I'd come from a digital mixer for my tracking. For my mixing, I tend to mix in the box anyways. But for the tracking side of it, I was already using 500 series preamps. So for me, it was a no-brainer as I was downsizing or scaling down the size of my audio interface from the 32 inputs of the Studio Live down to something less. I would go with the Cranborne system and put my 500 series preamps in it, and then later expand it a bit further. And I also purchased the 500 ADAT, so that gave me 2 more channels of 500 series modules. Plus, I've hooked up a couple Rupert Neve Designs Newton channels into a couple of the channels. I got my 11 rack going in a couple channels, and I've got the SPX90 going in the last 2 channels. And there's so much flexibility in the unit. I've covered it in my first video, so go watch that if you're not familiar with this unit. But basically, it's an audio interface. It's a headphone mixer. It's a monitor controller with mute and talkback, etc. And it's a summing mixer, and that summing mixer can be used as a tracking mixer for blending while you're recording. So it's like getting almost an analog mixer and an audio interface connected together. It's great, but there are some things you might not consider when you're setting it up, and there's some positives and some negatives. So let's go through some of the positives that you might not have thought about. So the unit itself has 8 inputs or 8 slots. If you fill it with 8 preamps, then you're going to have 8 different sources you can track through. But if you think about it, when you get the add-on units, the C.A.S.T N22 and N22H modules for remote connection to the unit, then you technically have 2 inputs into each of your channels. You've got the analog at the back, and you've got your Sheilded CAT5 or CAT6 remote box that you can switch between. So in a way, you're getting 16 inputs into the unit that you can switch between. Yes, you can only record 8 channels at once with a single unit, or 16 with the 500 ADAT added. But with the option to switch between different sources, you can technically have 16 things connected at once. So if you're like me and maybe have a bunch of synthesizers, you could have those on one of the inputs and then have microphones on the other input and switch between easily without a patch bay, so you wouldn't need to patch. But on top of that, if you've filled the unit with 500 series preamps, such as I have, and those 500 series preamps have high Z line inputs right on the front, you have another source right on your 500 series. So The way I look at it is I've actually got 3 inputs into each of these modules. I've got the cast, I've got the analog, and then I've pressed the line switch on the preamp, and I've got the line input on the front of the module. So I could literally have line inputs connected at the front, analog inputs connected at the back, and the cast analog inputs connected remotely, and switch between them at will. So that really expands an 8-channel input to 24 inputs selectable, with only 8 of them recordable or usable at a time. So that's one of the things you might not have thought about. The other thing that's great about this unit, because it's acting like an analog mixer, it also has dedicated sends and returns on each of the channels. So what does that mean? Well, for one, you don't need a 500 series module in each slot. And that was my next point. So I'll just bring that up now. You don't actually need any 500 series modules in this unit to record line level sources. You can plug line level right in the back and go straight into the digital audio interface and have that converted into your DAW. So with the send and receives at the back, you can insert anything into one of these channels. But if you don't have a 500 series pre, you could insert a channel strip, for example. So that's what I've done with my channel 11 and 12, which are my channels 3 and 4 on the 500 ADAT. And I've just used the send and returns to stick my 2 Newton channels into those 2 slots. So there's nothing showing on the actual 500 ADAT, but I can switch between the cast input or the analog input and send each of those sources to my 2 Newton channels and completely control the preamp, the EQ, and compressor of the Newton channels directly, and blend those using the R8 while tracking. And I could also send sources from my DAW back through the Newton channels if I wanted to. So those sends and returns on every channel are huge for expansion. And one of the things I plan to do is take my 10-slot Powerhouse 500 series chassis and eventually, when I have some more funds, fill that with some compressors and other EQs and use those as inserts directly on certain channels, so that I'm going to basically end up with channel strips on each of my 500 series preamps that are coming into the system. So don't disregard the fact that there's a send and return on every single channel in the box. Another thing you might not have considered is the DAW2 input. There are a couple things about it. DAW1 input is basically your return from your DAW, your mains coming back from your DAW. And DAW2 input can be an alternate USB input that you define in your DAW. It shows up as a DAW2 input on the interface choices. And what you could do there is, for example, send the click track to DAW2, so if it was just wanted to click, or you could have the mix with the click track going to DAW2, and DAW1 could be without the click track, so that the artists can listen to the version with the click through the aux output, aux level, and you can be listening in your headphones or in your monitors without the click while tracking. But there's an external DAW2 in, and that external in could be whatever you plug into there. That could be a preamp from a turntable maybe you're going to use for sampling. It could be some other source that you're playing back. And that external input is blended with the USB return from your DAW and comes into DAW2 input. So you actually have another source coming in to the mixer that you can use. So my plan, again, is to, when I downsize, I'm going to get rid of my secondary stereo system with the turntable. I'm going to hook my turntable up in my new studio and have it coming in the DAW2 input with a preamp that has a volume control, so I can control the volume of the stereo input into DAW2 directly from the preamp. So don't discount that. This unit also has MIDI DIN. Now, if you are like me and you work with older MIDI gear, such as my D50 at the back there, or my DW8000, or my Kai AX80, you know, they don't have USB input. So if you want to use older gear, you have a direct MIDI connection in and out of your computer without a secondary MIDI box or MIDI keyboard that has USB MIDI and MIDI DIN on it. So that's another feature you might not have thought of. Big thing to me is the fact that there's hands-on control right in front of you versus using software in your DAW to change, say, preamp volume levels or EQ settings on your 500 series slots. You can just reach out and change them rather than reaching to a mouse, dragging a slider or knob in your software. And to me, that's a huge part of workflow for me, and it's a huge workflow improvement. So that's another factor to consider. Lastly, this is for Windows users. Most audio interfaces present input 1 and 2 as an input into your Windows system. So if you want to use a microphone with an Apollo system for your Zoom calls, you're restricted to putting that microphone in channels 1 and 2 of your Apollo interface, because that's what gets presented to Windows as the input for microphones. The Cranborne system, you have to install Windows drivers for the Windows system, but those Windows drivers present every single input on the unit and every single output on the unit to Windows as your potential source for your default mic in source and your default output source. So if you want your Windows system to be playing out through the mix outs as your default, you can do that, which shows up as channels 1 and 2 on the Cranborne R8's interface into Windows. But if you wanted your Windows audio output to be coming out channel 5 and 6, you could do that and have them coming back through a preamp and control the volume directly on the hardware unit itself, if that's where you wanted to mix your Windows audio back with, say, live stuff that you're playing at the same time. So you've got a lot of flexibility in Windows to do that. I don't have a Mac, so I can't tell you how it presents in Mac, but I'm assuming it presents very similarly, that you get all the inputs showing as available. Okay, what about issues with the R8? I didn't have a lot, but I did have a few, and they are things you should be aware of. These are in no particular order. The first one is that there really is only one phone mix for artists. There's sort of two. You have the ability to have an aux output to the artist, and you can blend between the DAW return and the live mix on the analog mixer itself. Or you could flip that to DAW2 and listen to the DAW2 source. So you sort of get two mixes. One could be, somebody could be listening through the monitor headphones, somebody else through the aux headphones, and one could be on DAW2 and one could be on DAW1. But really the mix part of it's exactly the same. You can't give more bass to the bass player's mix from his live input and less to the drummer. It's just not possible, because there's only a single analog mixer here, and that gets summed to the aux output. So it's a limitation you have to be aware of when you get the unit. Another thing is, because this is a 500 series rack and it has a full amplifier inside of it, this unit gets hot. It has holes on the top for heat dissipation, and you should leave space above this unit. Now, I've rack mounted mine at an angle in my own custom plywood enclosure I've built into my desk, so there is a gap above there, but also because I'm at an angle, the heat is coming up towards the front of the panel, so when I touch here above the LED strip, it's pretty warm right there, like to the point where it's not burning warm, but it's warm enough that you notice, oh, that's pretty hot, and that's normal. But it does get very hot. It's going to generate heat in your room. If you don't have AC, that's going to be a problem for you, because it's going to add more heat to your room along with every other piece of gear you have. So keep that in mind. One of the issues I ran into when going to set this up on Windows is I use an antivirus software on Windows, which everyone should. I use C.A.S.T. It's very efficient, so it works very well. And one of the issues I ran into right away was when I downloaded the firmware upgrade for the units, C.A.S.T. blocked it as a threat. And when I disabled C.A.S.T. to continue downloading it, then Windows Defender wanted to block it as a threat. So there's something that Cranborne did in their compilation of the Windows firmware package that violates some rule that Microsoft considers to be risky, and the antivirus software is trying to prevent it. And even Chrome tried to prevent the download. I had to work around it. I had to confirm with Cranborne that it was safe, there wasn't an issue, and they confirmed to me there was no issue, and then disable all these things in order to get the software downloaded. So this could be something that, someone buys one of these units, goes to install it, and finds the first thing they can't do is get the firmware installed because antivirus is saying that there's an issue with it. For most people, they might just go, I better return this thing, I can't get the firmware. So I'd really like it if Cranborne would update that installation package to something more modern where it's not going to have that firmware blocking issue. Okay, next up, this is a minor issue, but it's an issue to be very aware of. This amplifier is extremely powerful that's built in here. Now, I use an Amphion system for my monitoring. I have Amphion 218s, and Amphion's Amp 500 has no volume control on it. So what's coming out of the Cranborne is not attenuated by my speakers in any way. And Cranborne recommends that you turn the volume down on your speakers to 0, bring the monitor level up to 50%, and then adjust your speakers till the volume is the volume you want to be listening at for mixing. And with the Amphions, I could not do that. So I was stuck with the situation where I could not turn the amp up past about maybe 8 o'clock on the dial without practically causing my ears to bleed. It was so freaking loud. So my solution temporarily was to put the dim switch on and blend control away from the DAW, and then I could get the volume knob to at least be responsive. But then I could hear every click and pop of the mute switches and the dim and the talkback, etc. So the solution is you need to get some external pads to put on the XLR outputs of the system so that you can attenuate the outcoming signal if your monitors don't attenuate it. I didn't have a problem with my mix cubes as my speaker B because they have a speaker adjustment on the back, but even those I had to turn down to like basically the first notch, and that's not quite loud enough. The second notch gets a bit too loud, so even on those it's a bit of an issue how powerful it is. So, it would be nice if there was a way to do that on the unit, but there is not. So keep that in mind. You might have to get some filters to put in if you don't have volume controls on your monitors. Another thing to watch for is when you are reading about expanding with the C.A.S.T system, you go, great, I can use some CAT5 or CAT6 cables, and you plug them in, and you could get a heck of a lot of noise if you do not get shielded CAT5 and CAT6 cables. And let me be very clear, 99% of people out in the world do not have shielded cables. They have regular CAT5, regular CAT6 cables, and shielded cables have a silver connector on the end. I'll show you one here, and that's the ground for the system. So if you don't have that, you can get a heck of a lot of ground loop noise from not having a ground on your system. And I ran into that, and it was 100% user error on my part. But if you don't know that they need to be shielded, you might think this thing doesn't work right, but it works perfectly as soon as you get the shielded cables. Another issue I ran into is I've been using an Audio-Technica dynamic gooseneck mic for my talkback system. When I went to the Cranborne Audio, I found that my talkback mic input level was a bit low, and there is no gain setting for the talkback input. There's a level control to the headphones, but not for the inputs. What I've since determined is that using a condenser mic instead works better. There's always phantom power coming out the talkback mic output, or input, I should say. So you can use a condenser mic for talkback. So just a recommendation, if you're going to get a talkback mic, probably want to get a condenser mic. Another issue you might not be aware of is the auxiliary output at the back of the unit. So that's the 2 mono outputs for the auxiliary send that you can send to an alternate, say, headphone amplifier. That is a variable output. It varies with sending the aux level up and down. So if you were thinking you were going to use the internal headphone aux mix for one headphone and then a separate external headphone amplifier for a bunch of other headphones with independent control for each of them, you will not have that, because as you turn up the aux level for the local headphones, you are also turning up the output to the external headphone amplifier that you've connected. So that can be an issue. And the last thing I just want to mention is when you don't have a 500 series module in the rack, and you have the option to use that slot by putting the slot bypass on the back, that works fine, but keep in mind that that input has no gain control. So it can take a line level input, and if your line level is hot enough, it's going to be great. But if your line level signal is quite low, as I found on my Poly Evolver and my OB6, when I plug them directly into the slot without a preamp, the output of the synth was not quite hot enough to get a great volume coming through the mixer. So I've had to move those particular instruments to channels with preamps and find something else to plug in. So I'm using the 11 rack and the SPX90, which didn't have that issue. But you may find that line level sources going into the slot bypassed slot aren't quite hot enough. That could be an issue. Okay, lastly, I just want to talk about some of the things I think could really be improved on this unit to make it 100% exactly what I would want from maybe version 2 of the R8 Cranborne, if you're listening. So here's the things I'd love to see. First of all, it would be wonderful to have a second cast link port on the back of the unit so that you could add a second 500 ADAT and use the second 500 ADAT's mixer to blend all those sources as well, giving you a 24-channel input system with 3 units. Now, you can add a second 500 ADAT right now and get the other 8 channels of 500 series coming in, but you can't use the mixer. You can't use the aux headphone on the second 500 ADAT if you're adding it to your 500 R8. So that would be an improvement I'd like to see. They probably have to make the unit bigger to have the space to include that on the back, but I don't know if that would be an issue. It's a 4 rack unit system. It might have to be a 5 unit system, and there's some other things they could do by putting it 5 units as well. So the other issue you might not have thought of with this system, it's not really a direct issue, but when you use cables into the line inputs at the front of 500 series preamps, those cables are hanging right above the mixer controls for each of the channels. So that's your source selection, your pan, and your mix volume. And with those cables sort of hanging over it, it's just awkward to reach the knobs. So I understand the knobs are at the bottom of the unit because that's the way the workflow goes. The signal comes in the top, it comes out the bottom, and you're turning up the volume there. I would love to see those knobs just above the 500 series modules instead. I think that's a simple fix. That's, you know, a physical fix in the design, but it doesn't take any more space. Move them above, have all the switches right at the top, and then have the knobs for volume control and pan right at the top above the 500 series modules. And I think that would be a great improvement for cases where you want to keep things plugged into the line inputs on your 500 series preamps all the time. I'd love to see a pad switch on the mix output that allowed you to set between the minus 20 dB and minus 30 dB. Now, I bought minus 30 dB pads for my Amphion system. They work fine. I think maybe I should have gone with minus 20 just to have a little bit more volume control, but they're working for me as is. But I'm not going to buy a second pair just so I can try minus 20. Would have been nice just to have a pad switch on there for those people who need it because their amplifier does not have a volume control. On the monitor control section, each of the buttons has nice little white LEDs that light up a brighter white when you press them. And I think something that would just make the unit that much more usable is if those LEDs were colored so that, for example, if you hit the mute button, it went from white to red or from green to red or something like that. Because I find that the brightness of the white, although it's noticeable, it's often not so noticeable that you notice, say, that you're on your B speaker or that you're in mono. I mean, you should be able to hear that, but if you didn't know, because maybe you're working in mono for a long time and then you start trying to blend something to stereo, stereo and you go, why is it not panning? It's kind of hard to see that one thing is brighter. So colored LEDs would just fix that. For me, you're so close to having a full analog mixer as your tracking input that what I would love to see is the ability to easily add external hardware effects like you would on an analog mixer. And really, to me, that would just be adding an extra auxiliary channel on this. You've got your headphones, but that's really just taking the regular mix. I would like an aux mix on here that could go to headphones if you want, but you could use it as an effects send, and I'd like a dedicated effects return. So if I just had a single external effects knob for each of the channels, and then a single effects return that could blend in with the headphones or the monitors or both for adding external effects while tracking or even while mixing down, that would just be a great option. Again, I think the unit would have to be a whole nother 1U higher, so a 5U high unit instead. Another thing I'd love to see is on the mix return to your DAW. Currently, there is no direct way to insert hardware effects. So if you want to use a hardware bus compressor on the mix coming back, you basically have to do a mix down, then take the stereo mix back through the system and through the hardware compressor you want, and then add it then. I would love to see just an insert on the back for the mix bus, basically, to give you the ability to put compression and EQ in a hardware state on the actual mix coming back from the unit. Okay, the last idea I have that would make this unit even better, and I think it, I'm not an engineer, but I think technically the bones of it are there, and it wouldn't take a lot in a redesign to add this feature other than maybe needing the extra space. And this idea would actually get rid of my requirement for wanting to have an extra auxiliary output and effects return. And that would be, what if you could make each of these channels capable of acting like an inline console on a regular analog mixer? And the way you would do that is, we already have the analog to digital converter on every channel constantly sending the output of each slot to your converter. So that's already going in there. Ideally, what I'd like to see is, we have the ability to send USB into the channel. We have the ability to send USB out of the channel, but we don't have the ability to set the channel on analog, send it into the DAW, have each channel in the DAW have listen back turned on or echo back or whatever it's called, and then have that come back through the channel's digital analog converter so that you could hear any processing you did on each channel through the DAW. Because the way it's working right now is, if you're tracking and using the analog mixer on the R8 to blend your levels while tracking, if you want to add external effects to one of the channels, then you have to remove that channel from the mixer on the R8 and use it as a DAW mix as part of what's coming from the DAW. I'd love to see that as an individual option on each of the channels. So a little switch to say, put this into inline mode. And what it would do is it would take the USB return and pass it out through the mixer rather than passing the channel directly to the mixer. So it would come into the 500 series channel strip. It would go up the analog to digital converter into the DAW. The DAW would do its effects processing. It would then be assigned to come back the same channel on the USB return, and you'd hear it with the mixer there, and then you'd adjust the levels and the panning right there. And to me, that would be the ideal situation, because then I'd have an inline console for my system. I would then expand every one of my slots with a 500 series chassis as an insert. I would then put a preamp, a compressor, and an EQ on every analog channel I had, and I would now have an inline analog mixer completely in a rack format that I could arrange however I wanted. And that's kind of the final improvement I'd like to see. So hopefully you found that helpful. Some of the things I've discussed. I really do love this system. It's going to be with me for quite a long time until they come out with that version 2 where they put all my improvements I suggested. This is what I'm going to be sticking with as my primary tracking and mixing system. And I've now got a Windows laptop, so I'm all set up to use this as a mobile rig as well for cases where I might want to do that. Thanks for watching my channel, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.